listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
And we are live from America and just outside the Matrix. It is time once again for the show that brings you the truth behind the headlines. I'm investigative journalist Lee Stranahan, and this is The Backstory. So we are here solo today, and I'll explain that in a second for those of you who were waiting with rapt attention. Austin Pelley to be joining us today, which we announced on Friday, but things change. As David Mamet once said, things change. So we'll talk about that in a second. But our multifaceted engineer, Saul, is there. You just can't hear him. But since you can hear me, Saul's here. Right, Saul? That's a good way to tell. The day Saul doesn't show up, this will be a blank screen and you won't hear me, which could be a blessing in disguise. But our intrepid producer, who I don't have a graphic for again, Rod from Philly, is with us. Hey, Rod, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Lee. How about yourself?
Now, by the way, it's a rough day for Philly because a famous son of Philadelphia, comedian Bob Saget, passed away yesterday. Did you know he's from Philly? You must have known that, right?
Yeah, I did know. Yeah, I did know that.
So Bob Saget, age 65, he just performed in Florida, and he was found unresponsive at the hotel in Florida, and we'll see what happened. Did you know that about 4 years ago, he'd married Kelly Ripa, the lovely Kelly Ripa? Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he married Kelly Ripa in 2018. So, like I said, I don't know when exactly. That's why I say about 4 years. But, you know, what's he doing he would have been 61? Marrying Kelly Ripa at 61. Maybe we didn't know what the cause of death was now. I'm just saying. But were you shocked by the death of Bob Saget?
Yeah, definitely. Because you know, sometimes comedians have alcohol or drug problems, or some of those issues. They have a long history of famous comedians, and he doesn't have that history. So it's kind of a wait and see to what was his cause of death right now.
Now, what he does have is he, of course, is a famous TV father on the show Full House, and then he was as dirty as you can be in a stand-up act, right? You know that, right? A bit of a potty mouth.
Yeah, I had the same reaction when I used to watch Thomas the Train. I had Jordan, and then I saw George Carlin on HBO. So the same thing with Bob Saget.
Not quite as political as Carlin, just dirty, filthy. Watch The Aristocrats. Watch that film. Saul, have you seen The Aristocrats? Rod, have you seen that? Saul has not seen it. Rod, have you seen The Aristocrats?
I have not.
The Aristocrats is about one of the most pointlessly filthy jokes you've ever heard in your life. And it's a bunch of comedians telling that joke. Not The Aristocats. That's a Disney film. Totally different and not dirty. I'm just saying. But Bob Saget is gone. And one of the last things he talked about was the death of Betty White, who passed away, you know, over the holidays. So some people think that's ironic or weird. It's nothing weird about it. She passed away. He talked about it. Now he's gone. Do you think there's a big conspiracy involved in the death of Bob Saget? Rod, be honest.
Conspiracy, no. But like I said, usually when people pass away on their own without any notice of degrading health, is a little bit of concern, especially like, you know, as far as we know, no drugs, no foul play, no alcohol. So.
And he wasn't shoveling snow. We'll talk about that in a second. Let me do the boom, solo boom on The Backstory. So wanted to mention the guests today. In the second hour, Kerry Smith will be joining us. Coming up this hour, we got a 45-minute interview with the great Peter Oliver. Now, one of the things, Rod, I'm not shocking you here. Saul may be shocked. But you and I have talked about this already. Because I'm doing the show solo, basically what happened was Shane Stranahan, my son, who was the co-host of Fault Lines, decided he wanted to move on. You know, and I'll talk about that maybe. It's similar to me to Bob Schlehuber from Political Misfits leaving. There's been stories about this, Rod. Have you seen the stories about people who are after the COVID-19 thing, just kind of leave their jobs? Have you seen that?
Yeah, I was actually just reading something just before we came on, and just about, you know, people migrating to different parts of the country just because of restrictions and other things that are happening.
Which makes some sense to me. Of course, I'm up in South Dakota. By the way, South Dakota this morning I got up, it was 8 degrees. Earlier in the morning, it was like 6 degrees when I did the morning news roundup, which I've been doing. And then I saw that Boston had canceled school tomorrow because of frigid weather. And I was like, well, that's going to have to be pretty damn cold, right? It's going to be 13 degrees in Boston tomorrow. And all I can say is, I don't know if can I say wussy, Saul? I can say wussy, Rod. You wussies, you're wicked wussies. I'll even say that to people in Boston. Because they're canceling school over 13-degree weather. It's been like 8 degrees and -4 degrees and stuff. You've heard me slightly complain about it, Rod, in the way it is in South Dakota every freaking day, right?
No, yeah, it just reminds me to my time in Minnesota, so I understand.
Right. You went to school in Minnesota. You know, upper Midwest, Minnesota, South Dakota. You know what? I'm not even in the real frigid North Dakota. North Dakota gets colder than South Dakota. South Dakota, it's like the tropics. Not really, but you know what I'm saying. Oh, speaking of the tropics, so I was planning as of last year. Let me just complain about something. Then I'll finish the story on what happened with Shane. But I was thinking last year, maybe I'll go to Vegas for a week sometime this winter because the weather will be warmer. And I think I had mentioned that in the show before. I think you probably heard me talk about that, right, Rod?
No, not Vegas. That's the first time I heard you say that.
So I was thinking going to Vegas because it's warm. It's got lots of great restaurants, including 3 Gordon Ramsay restaurants, which are all very good. Gordon Ramsay steak restaurant over at the Paris is very good. And weed, legal weed. The weed is legal. So, you know, that to me sounds like a vacation. And then I was looking into it, and you can get a hotel in Vegas for like $35 a night at the Luxor or the Excalibur or someplace like that. One of your more embarrassing casino hotels. But you know what they do is there's a $40 to $50 per night resort fee. Have you seen that BS?
Yeah, you know, going on travels last couple of years, they sneak that in there, the resort fee.
Right, and I don't want to pay a resort fee unless they bring the gummies to my room or something. Then, even then, it's a little pricey. I'm just saying that at that point and I said something about it on Twitter, and I got a flurry of people going, yeah, exactly what you said. Yeah, they've been sneaking that in. And it's BS. And people linked to a couple articles on this. But it's crazy. And I'm not going to go. I refuse. I don't want to pay a fee. And they charge you like $10 a day to use the internet. No, not doing that. You see what I'm saying? So what happened was Shane, everyone knows who's been listening to the show, John, it was Kiriakou, the great John Kiriakou, who's been the co-host over here for most of the past year. He left on Friday. That was his last day. He's moving down to Political Misfits, noon to 2, right here on Radio Sputnik. Was he on today, Saul? You engineer that show. Okay, so how was it? It was great, Saul says, and I'm inclined to believe him. Because, again, the guy can just cut me off right like that. So I'm like, I'm not going to bicker with him. But I knew it would be great. John would be great. So what was supposed to happen was Austin Pelly was supposed to join this show. But then Shane over the weekend kind of decided he wanted to move on. So they were going to move Austin to Fall Lines and not here. And they said, you'll be solo. And I've done the show solo before, so I'm not scared or anything. I can handle that. But this morning, and Saul, did you notice I didn't hear Austin on Fall Lines either? So it's coming in tomorrow. Now, is there a possibility, I'll give people some inside dope, is there any possibility Shane will be back? Yes, I would say, from what I know, and I may have some inside dope on this, he may want to come back. But I will say he loved working at Sputnik. He knows what a great job it is. He loved working with Jamar, and he liked working on Fall Lines. And so we'll see. But it's possible, I say, Shane could be back on Sputnik in some capacity. If not soon, I would say not this week, no way. But possibly after that, we'll see. You know, things change. That's what I was saying before. Now, the headlines, aside from the fact that they're canceling school, those wussies in Boston, they're wicked wussies, because it's going to be cold. Stop. I'll tell you where else they've canceled school, and they did it again today, is Chicago. Rod, you've seen this, right?
Yeah, the teachers' unions over there are they're using COVID as the reason to not teach in person, but I believe that's just an excuse to not teach these kids who don't want to learn and unruly. Yeah,
well, because who would want to teach in? No one grows up thinking, I really want to teach in Chicago schools. You see what I'm saying? The same way few people grow up and say, I want to be a beat cop in Baltimore. Or you see what I'm saying? Who says that? No one says that. So Lori Lightfoot over the weekend, they're starting to say we're not going to pay you to the teachers. Lori Lightfoot is, what's interesting is the teachers union is saying they are worried about COVID and they don't think there's enough precautions being taken. Now, you also probably saw today was the day the government was supposed to start cracking down on those vaccination mandates for federal workers. But Asa Hutchinson, for instance, who's the governor of Arkansas, or Arkansas, as you may pronounce it, if you're trying to read it, and don't care about the way things are actually pronounced. In Arkansas, he's saying, don't worry about it. And what's happening in court, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, maybe even with Kerry Smith later in the show. Did you see Sonia Sotomayor's Supreme Court Justice, dopey comments, lies, misinformation on COVID-19 over the weekend that people were talking about? Rod, you must have seen this, right?
Yeah, I did. And it's kind of embarrassing a little bit.
It is very embarrassing because she's a justice for life. Once you get in the Supreme Court, you're there for life. So she was saying 100,000 kids are in critical condition because of COVID-19. And even the Washington Post and Politico said, no, that's wrong. And she's one of the people making the decision on these Biden administration mandates. Does that scare you a little bit, Rob, before we go to break? Quickly, yes, no. Are you scared?
A lot.
Right. It should be. And by the way, Sonia Sotomayor should also be kicked off social media. But coming up from Geneva, the great Peter Oliver, one of the big stories right now, of course, are the talks between the U.S. and Russia. Peter Oliver is there. The first day didn't go great, but I kind of wouldn't have expected it to. That's me. I'm not trying to be overly cynical. Coming up next, Peter Oliver joining us here on The Backstory.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy.
I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
We are back. You're listening to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM, AM 1390 in the Washington, D.C. area. We got Peter Oliver joining us from Geneva in just one moment. But let me just mention the programming note is that because I'm doing the show just me right now, one of the things we've talked about is getting some of our great friends of the show and guests to make them co-host. So he's not going to be on today, is he, Rod? Is it possible Carmine's showing up today at all?
No.
Okay. Starting next Monday, that makes it just, I know what to say now. Starting next Monday, it's Carmine Mondays. The great Carmine Sabia will be joining us as a guest host on Mondays. And you talked to Jason, right?
Correct.
Okay. I just want to make sure. And Rod has already talked. Jason Goodman will be our co-host for 1 hour on Tuesdays. And so we're going through, and we may even talk. Do you know what I'd kind of like to do, Rod? Is Unsafe Wednesdays, let's say, where we have either Kerry Smith or Carter Laren, two of the two hosts of Unsafe Space. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So we can mix it up, wouldn't put too much work on either one of them. We'll see. Joining us right now from Geneva to untangle the talks, to give you the straight dope on it, great friend of the show, great correspondent from RT. He's been an international correspondent for years, Peter Oliver. Hey, Peter. Welcome. How you doing today?
Hello. I'm very well. I have to tell you first off the bat, though, I'm not in Geneva. I'm in Berlin. I just got back from my Christmas and New Year vacation, so it was too much of a quick turnaround for me to get down to Switzerland. So RT, if you tune into RT, you'll see my excellent colleague Charlotte Dubinsky, who is down there in Switzerland covering this meeting. But I've been across it from up here in the German capital all day today as well. It hasn't gone great.
No, it hasn't.
I know you said you weren't expecting much. I know you said you weren't expecting much, but what we have seen is I'm starting to think I was quite confident going into this, and after hearing the mood music coming from both the Russian deputy foreign minister and the US deputy secretary of state, it's not filling me with a lot of confidence right now.
Yeah, and what Lavrov, we'll talk about what Lavrov said in 1 second, but let's talk about, you're in Berlin now, forgive me.
Yeah.
But one of the things we're talking about today is this conference in Geneva. Let me ask you this, though. As a correspondent, the last big event I was at was I was in Helsinki for the Trump-Putin summit. And
right.
You're a sports fan, right, Peter? You like footy, for instance, right?
Oh, yes.
Now, let me ask you this. This is my experience. Oftentimes, the last sporting event I went to is I won tickets to the Washington Redskins back when they actually had a name. And we saw the game. And it's kind of interesting to be live at a sporting event. But if you really want to watch it and get a better view of the events going on in the field, you're better off watching it on television, I think. Because even though it's exciting to be there, I don't think it's the best way to watch it. And I'm going to make an analogy to Helsinki. I was there in Helsinki. It was exciting to be there. However, you know what? I didn't see anything. I would have been better off watching on TV. Do you feel like, do you understand what I'm getting at? And do you agree you can cover this event in Geneva possibly better not being in Geneva? It's exciting to be there than you could if you weren't. What do you think, Peter? You've covered a lot of big events. What do you think of my assessment there?
Surely it depends what type of access you've got there now. I tell you what I would say. It's certainly, if you go to big things like the OSCE meetings, the Munich Security Conference, the G20, G7, I mean, the amount of times I've been thinking I'm right on the spot and I'm at because you can only be in one place at one time, but thinking, right, it's the meeting between the British Foreign Secretary and the Estonian Foreign Minister. This is the meeting I'm going to be at. This is the one I'm going to be able to ask a question at. And then all of a sudden you get a message from the newsroom going, are you on the spot in this meeting between the Italian president and so and so? And you're like,
right.
It's all the way over the other side of the building. I'm not getting there for that. So there are times that it can, sometimes there are so many things going on, it can be just potluck that you are in the right place at the right time. You hope that you have more of those, that you're in the right place at the right time in your career than the other way around. These type of meetings, though, the one that's going on in Geneva right now, a lot of the idea of it is that the press is not excluded, but that these talks have to happen without the likes of myself screaming questions at one party or the other, because it doesn't go down very well. And when you've got, look, it does seem like they've put all of the cards on the table. This is Sergei Ryabkov and the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman. They've both mentioned quite a few times, in fact, that these talks have been full and frank and all sides have been put, all of the points have been laid out. But what you've got, though, is, you've got the Russian side coming away saying that they don't think that the American side understands the gravity of the situation, that key issues are still pending, that demands have been made that Moscow cannot retreat from. And now you've got on the other side to that, you've got the American side saying that, look, it's a non-starter for them, the idea that NATO would not expand further into Eastern Europe. However, I like to think of myself as some kind of eternal optimist. I think one of the takeaways from what Wendy Sherman had to say for me is the small line that they could well look at, that they were open to discussing the size and scope of NATO military exercises in Eastern Europe. Now, one of the things that was put on the table in the plans put out by Moscow was basically, you don't play war games on our western border in Eastern Europe, and we will move our war games to the east of the Ural Mountains, which is, miles away from anywhere to do with where troops currently are inside Russia on those troops that are built up near to the border with Ukraine. Now, that seems to have disappeared a little bit from these discussions that have been going on, but I think they're quite important to get there, because that would at least allow some face saving, but also some ability to say that victories had been made by both sides. Now, if we were also to look on the other side of not so great news, is what you've got coming out of the Russian camp later on Monday evening, is them saying that, look, if the United States continues to place advanced weapon systems in Europe, then Russia isn't ruling out there being some form of military response to that. So that is about as well, it's about as dire a situation as you can get when it comes to these peace talks, these talks aimed at trying to sort out the situation in Eastern Europe. And you've got, well, one side saying we're not going to do whatever you want, and the other side saying, well, if you do what we think you're going to do, we may well attack you. So it's sticky at the moment. There is a lot of talking left to go, and it's not often that I will take what Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, has to say and think, actually, I think he's right there. Mr. Stoltenberg saying that basically what we should expect from these talks is they are going to be laying down the path for there being further talks that hopefully will lead to more talks. I mean, I'm inclined to think that as long as they're talking, they're not fighting, and that's the best for everybody, not just for the people of Ukraine, not just for the people of Russia, not just for the people of Eastern Europe. That's best for the world, because these are the two countries, the United States and Russia. These are the two countries that have the big weapons, the big boom boom sticks, the ones that end everything. So you don't want those two nations literally fighting one another, despite how bad the situation is between the two of them. I think there is a commitment to try and stop it getting that far. But when it comes to these talks, and there are going to be a series, it's not just this meeting at the deputy foreign ministerial level. There's also going to be a summit, a NATO summit that's taking place over the next few days. Rebikov, the deputy foreign minister of Russia, is going to be meeting with NATO representatives on Wednesday in Brussels, and with the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, on the 13th, Thursday, I believe. The words coming out, what we're hearing coming out of Moscow, is that after that, well, Russia's going to make a decision on whether continuing with these talks is worth their while. What I can tell you is I'm penciled in the diary to be flying to Vienna next week, because there is supposed to be more talks to do with the OSCE in Vienna. So despite that being said, the plan at the moment is that this is going to be an ongoing process. Wasn't good, though. After Monday, I was expecting them to come away with a little bit more, a little bit more of a, well, we don't see eye to eye, but we're willing to get on with more and more talks. At the moment, as I mentioned, you've got the US side saying it's some of the proposals from Russia are a non-starter, and Russia saying that if the US puts weapons in Eastern Europe, then things could get very serious indeed. It's a very tricky situation at the moment, and it's one, though, that I do think has been overcomplicated massively. Now, I'm loath to make predictions. I don't like to, because I'm usually wrong. That's why, Lee. I'm loath to make predictions. But what I do think there has to be some kind of deal in which both Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin can go to their respective people and go, I stood toe-to-toe with the other guy and we won, we got this. Yeah, we give them a little bit, but we got this. And whatever that is, that will get that over the line, that's what we need to get to. And the hope for where I could see it working would be if there was concrete promises that there wouldn't be weapons placed in Ukraine, particularly missiles, and that Russia would make those commitments to move their military drills beyond the Urals. NATO would say that they wouldn't hold military drills in Eastern Europe. Now, whether that happens or not, that's, of course, where we need to get to. We're a long way from there at the moment.
Well, yeah. Now, Peter, let me talk to you about a recent event. And there's about 4 places I could get this wrong, so stop me if I get this wrong.
Not a problem.
But we had a situation in Kazakhstan recently.
Yes.
Now, this is what I'm going to argue. Russia led a six-nation force of peacekeepers that went in, and I'm going to say that by all indicators, that was an effective, in other words, it does seem like order and peace have been restored to Kazakhstan. They put down the unrest quickly and efficiently, and with a number of paratroopers. And I'm going to say that that shows a certain amount of whatever the opposite of ineptness is, efficacy on the Russian military's part, right? As opposed to the last thing the U.S. did, which was Afghanistan, which we all know didn't go that well. So if I was looking at the Russian military planning and execution, I'd go, and I am looking at it, but if I was an official, let's say, from the U.S. or anybody, a world leader looking at this, I'd go, gee, the Russians were able to plan and execute an effective military operation with a minimum of muss and fuss, whereas the U.S. screwed up pulling out of Afghanistan, right? I mean, am I wrong in thinking that there's a real contrast between the way Russia handles their military affairs recently and the U.S., Peter?
I think there's very different situations on the ground in Afghanistan and Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan's a place I know pretty well. I would never claim to be any type of expert in it, but I've spent quite a bit of time there. My family spent quite a bit of time in Astana, as it was, but Nur Sultan, as it's called now. And it's the operation that was carried out, I mean, it's caught us all by shock. I was over in the United Kingdom while this was all happening. I was with my dad. He was shocked by what he was seeing that was happening there. He's still in touch with quite a few people over in Kazakhstan. And this escalated massively quickly. And the situation with regards to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, sometimes said to be a bit like a former Soviet bloc NATO in its own right. It is and it isn't. Let's just say it is for now. They were invited in. They were, well, not invited in. They were summoned by the Kazakh leader because they were needed to try and bring about some kind of peace there. Now, there are many theories abound as to why they went immediately to outside help. Some suggesting that there may have been, there are allegations, not some suggesting there are charges of treason that have been levelled against some former quite senior figures in the country. The idea being that you needed somebody to come from outside because at the time, the president of Kazakhstan couldn't trust, or certainly didn't feel, President Tokayev didn't feel like he could trust his own security forces at that particular time. So he went to his allies.
Peter, let's expand that for a quick second. When you say a senior official has been charged with treason, this is a guy who was the head of the intelligence service. That's like the last guy you want charged with treason, correct? He's not.
Well, particularly when you need to put troops out to quell violent uprising that is showing a level of sophistication that at one point it looked like Kazakhstan was heading for full civil war at one point. When you were hearing reports of military bases or police stations, caches of weapons finding their way onto the streets. And I mean, I've been in quite a few countries where they have toppled their governments and toppled their leaderships, and the last thing you want to see in those situations is arms being handed out freely to people on the streets, as we were seeing in Almaty just very recently. Now, that is a situation whereby you do need the trust of a fully functional security service, and if you are in doubt about the head of your security service, or the former head of the security service, as President Tokayev clearly is, and certainly was at the time, you are in a position whereby you can't trust, I would imagine, your own your own forces to an extent. So you have to go to your neighbours and go to your allies. I guess in many reasons that's why they have these type of alliances, why they exist in the first place.
Now it's a very big deal that the former head of intelligence is charged with treason. But I agree, the situation's different. But when you think about the ineptness, I'll just give one example with Afghanistan, which everyone will remember. We did a drone attack that we said was taking out an al-Qaeda leader. We took out an aid worker and his family. That's what we did. That's pretty inept military operation.
Yeah.
And it would be like if the Russian forces in Kazakhstan had gone in and killed a family of Kazakhstan aid workers and their family, which there was nothing like that. And even the way Putin came out and said that these group of forces, he was not bragging about it, but just saying it showed they're effective. And I'm going to say the U.S., when we were pulling out of Afghanistan, not just a drone strike, but the inability to get some people out, the whole thing, America looked bumbling. You don't want to use the word bumbling about a nuclear power like the U.S., but there you go.
No, really.
They looked inept to me. And Russia looked confident and effective in, the Afghanistan thing could have gone differently, but it doesn't seem like the U.S., and we have plenty of other examples of the U.S. military not being prepared for this. Scott Ritter's spoken eloquently on this show a number of times about this. But the operation in Kazakhstan, that went well from a Russian perspective, right, Peter?
I think they're certainly going to be happy with it. It is an ongoing mission currently. When I think they'll be reviewing this, and I would imagine you will see, you will see Vladimir Putin handing out medals, or certainly Mr. Shoigu handing out medals, the defense minister, if they complete this mission as is supposed to, which I believe it's around 3 weeks is the time frame at the moment that they're going to be in and then out. I would expect that if they can do that with the way that it's being carried out thus far, it's going to go down as they're going to be pretty confident with the way that their military has handled this. Unfortunately, the way that is definitely going to be viewed in some sections of the media is, oh my God, the Russians can do this, and they are even more terrifying now. We were scared of them when we thought that they were pretty shambolic. We're now I would expect that there's a think piece somewhere being written as I speak about this type of stuff. So while it would be, as you say, in stark contrast to military operations abroad that we've seen from some countries, particularly some NATO countries, it comes with its own downsides as well. Now, that is, of course, if this mission, this deployment of troops, it's not just Russian troops, as you said, also Belarusian, Armenian, some other members of the CSTO as well have sent forces, but it is for the most part a Russian mission. It's commanded by Russian military professionals there. So what you're going to see is, if this does end up going to plan and they are pulled out in a few weeks, I think it's going to go down as a bit of a success for the Russian military.
Now you're in Germany. I was watching for the coverage on this Deutsche Welle today, the German news service. Deutsche Welle, DW, sort of the equivalent of RT, but I will say, without the great graphic design of RT. RT does a very good, and I say that as an aesthetic consideration. But DW today, I noticed one thing, even in the U.S. coverage. I think the U.S. coverage and DW coverage is the best I've seen recently. Let me explain. By putting out their proposal, Russia now, I've heard more accurate information where they've been forced to say, Russia wants this. And a few weeks ago, when I listened to the media coverage, They were just yapping about Russian troops on the border.
December, we heard from Sergei Lavrov. I know when I was in Stockholm for the meeting with him at the OSCE in December, that was the reason why they published everything and they put it all out in the open, because they weren't happy with the way when it come to previous meetings with the United States, and they talked about things that they thought were going to be spoken about in private, and then a very heavily edited version of what had been put forward from the Russian side had been linked to the preferred media that the Biden administration has, and that seems to be the way that the messaging comes out from the US side if you don't get out ahead of it yourself. So that's why they put that out there, so that it's there for everybody to see. And it can boil down quite simply as to what Russia really is after here. Russia doesn't want Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO because Russia doesn't want NATO weapons, namely missiles, on its border. And it comes across in the wording of the documents that the Russian side put out is there are quite big comparisons to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Russia doesn't want these missiles on their border next to the major population center, or doesn't want potentially there to be missiles near the big population center, just as the United States didn't want Russian missiles off the coast of Florida. And this is the way that the Russian side is arguing it, saying, look, that's why they've put it all out there in black and white. Will they get everything they asked for? Almost certainly not. But if this is to end somewhere and to end well, they're going to have to get some of that. And it means that there are going to have to be concessions on both sides. And this is where you get into the situation with who's coming to the table. Now, I've been lucky enough to see up close and personal a few US Secretary of States. Antony Blinken, certainly not the worst one that I've seen. That would be Rex Tillerson. I'll always remember being in Vienna for the International Atomic Energy Agency, and I think it was one of Rex Tillerson's either his first or his second foreign trip, and he walked around the corner, not expecting there to be the foreign press there, and we all asked him questions, and he said to one of his aides, he was like, "Are these guys going to be everywhere?" Yeah, we are. Absolutely everywhere, asking you questions. You're supposed to talk to us. Anyway, sorry, what I was saying about Antony Blinken is that while he's clearly a very intelligent man, there does come across as an air that he must be the most intelligent person in every room. And whether that translates into diplomacy, I'm not sure. And while he is clearly an expert in multiple fields when it comes to international relations, I am not sure whether that is an attitude that will lend itself to finding solutions right now. And we've heard just in the last 24 hours, Antony Blinken hasn't exactly endeared himself to Russia with his comments concerning Kazakhstan, where he said that what was it? That once you let Russians into your house, it can be difficult to get them out. Which, that's not a way to go down for making friends, particularly with the US's record when it comes to getting in the house, as it were. Of course, I speak to you from Germany. We can also look at Korea, Japan, just about anywhere else the United States has ever been. That they have a tendency to remain.
No, yeah. We were talking about Afghanistan, 20 years. And, even then, when we leave, it doesn't go well. Now, you talked about this upcoming NATO meetings. These are not theoretical. The NATO meetings are happening, correct? That's on the schedule already, right?
There is a NATO summit taking place. I believe it's Wednesday. It is, up in Brussels. And the Russian foreign minister will be on the sidelines of that NATO meeting with NATO officials. You'd imagine you would see a meeting between himself and Jens Stoltenberg. the Secretary General. You're also going to be looking at because there is a strange situation with the way this is gone about. I mean, it's not strange when you look at it, is they've gone to the people who really need to be involved, which is the United States and Russia. I spoke about the potential for the serious destruction that both of those countries have, that they are the ones that need to come to agreements because it's ultimately them that can cause the big problems. But we have been quite remiss ourselves, I think, Lee, in talking about this. We haven't mentioned any of the European side yet, considering all of this happening in Europe. And I would imagine that you're going to see meetings with a few of the EU members of NATO, their representations as well during that summit that takes place on Wednesday. And then Thursday, of course, you've got the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. They are also going to be discussing what's going on in, what's going on with this, trying to find a solution to calm things down between Russia and NATO. What we need, Lee, we need a couple of treaties to be sorted out from this. And unfortunately, they are looking further and further away at the moment. So we can expect big things from this summit that will be taking place on Wednesday, this NATO summit. We can expect big things to come out of Geneva still. But whether we do, I'm, as I said, starting to get less and less confident about it. Ideally, the best case scenario we can have is what Jens Stoltenberg has said, is that these talks can be used to build further discussions on. Now, I was in Geneva last summer when the meeting took place between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, and we left that feeling a little confident, a little happy at the fact that they obviously weren't going to sort out all of their problems, but they had made steps. They restarted diplomatic ties, something that had been dead. You know, you can't do diplomacy if you don't have diplomats talking to one another. But since then, some of these things have gone back. There's been problems with diplomats. There's been problems with visas being granted to the United States. There's been problems from the other side with for US diplomats in Russia as well. And we seem to have slipped back since then. So in some ways, I think it's a good idea that they have started with this happening at the deputy foreign minister level. But I mean, ultimately, I see my future, and it is heading back to Geneva, most likely for another meeting between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, probably in the next few months. That is, of course, unless the Russian side decide after these next few meetings that it's just not worth doing. And what happens then, well, I have absolutely no idea, because that really is all bets off. And you've got a situation whereby diplomacy would have failed. And that's not a situation we want to be in. You've had the German foreign minister today, Annalena Baerbock. She's been in Italy with Luigi Di Maio, her counterpart there, saying that there is no other solution, there is no other option than a diplomatic solution. The big boys are talking now. I mean, it may be about Europe, what they're talking about, but they have been quite resoundingly cut out of all of this. Now, you had Josep Borrell, who's the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs. It's as close as the European Union gets to a foreign minister, trying to say that they're very much involved, but, you know, you can't be very much involved if you're not at the table. The French side in particular, I mean, Emmanuel Macron has been very vocal about him wanting to see the EU take more responsibility for Europe's defence. So the idea that the United States would be essentially negotiating on their behalf, that's not going to go down well with Emmanuel Macron personally. It's also not going to go down with him, considering he's got a big election coming up this year. And I mean, if I was a betting man, I am a betting man, but I don't bet on this type of stuff. I would say that he would probably win, Emmanuel Macron. But it's going to be tight. And he has real opposition that he's facing from far-right nationalist groups within France. And he has to, in order to win over the voters that may be umming and ahhing over whether it's him, whether it's Macron, or whether it's somebody else, he has to be able to say, look, I am the man that can lead this militarily. I am the man that can lead this in terms of defence of France and of Europe, and also be able to be the to bestride Europe, not just Europe, but bestride Europe on the world stage, and be able to negotiate at the big table. And of course, he's been kicked off the big table, or not even invited to the big table right now. The new German government is a little different on this. Germany, of course, always likes to do everything a little bit different. They have Germany and defence is a particularly strange topic. But when you look at the situations that you have concerning foreign policy in Germany, what you do have at the moment is a big split between the foreign ministry and the Chancellor's office, particularly when it comes to any issues concerning Russia, and particularly when it comes to, of course, the all-important Nord Stream 2 pipeline when it comes to Russia, which is ultimately all linked to what we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes or so about these talks with Ukraine, because we still haven't moved on from those issues that we've been talking about at the end of last year, which is the super high gas prices, Europe having an increased demand for gas, Germany in particular having a huge demand for gas, all of these, and needing that pipeline that goes from Russia directly into Germany. You've got the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, on one side, absolutely vehemently opposed to that pipeline. Also somebody who, in the lead up to the election, essentially said Germany's foreign policy will do whatever the United States does. That didn't go down particularly well, and probably one of the reasons, amongst many other things, that she's not Chancellor, but she is the foreign minister now. There's a split there between her party, the Greens, and the Chancellor's party. Olaf Scholz is the new German Chancellor, and he seems to be more pragmatic about getting things done when it comes to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. He's been keen to say that it's just a business, it's an infrastructure project. But what you do have in the background all the time, though, is then the foreign ministry saying, if Russia does this, if Russia does that, we want to be able to shut the gas off. Now, whether that would even be legal without any big changes to the framework, I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly. Don't think it is, though. And that's one of the big stumbling points that we have at the moment, is a split in the new government there. So when you talk about these upcoming meetings, the NATO meetings, the OSCE meetings, to discuss what's happening, these will be the chance for the European side to put forward what they have to say. I was about to say their two penneth worth, but I think that might be, I've been in the UK for a few weeks, Lee. Sometimes I go back to too many colloquialisms from my homeland. But to stick in their 2 cents about where they see this situation concerning Russia, concerning NATO, concerning Ukraine, where it's all going to go. And there is no unified voice. Now, the only time there is any unified voice in Europe when it comes to this situation is if Russia invades Ukraine, there will be grave consequences. Everybody seems to agree on that. Nobody agrees on what those consequences are. And nobody agrees on what to do if there is no invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So there's still a long way to go yet. And there is potential that there could be some interesting things come up from these meetings in Brussels and Vienna that are coming up over the coming days, and of course then that extra meeting next week in Vienna, which I'll be attending and be all over for you guys. But as I say, as it stands at the moment, there are so many different issues that link back to exactly what is going to happen in Ukraine, what is going to happen concerning Russia and NATO. And ultimately, I think we still need to go back to that one point that I put across there, is that this isn't as complicated a situation as perhaps it's being made out to be, and that a lot can be sorted out as long as the diplomats can do some diplomacy, which they do seem to be very short of at the moment. While you've got Wendy Sherman saying that she's come there to listen, She has come to listen, but there doesn't seem to be any movement. Similar message coming from Sergei Ryabakov, the Russian deputy foreign minister as well. Lots of listening going on, not a lot of movement just yet. Without any movement, we're not going to get a solution anytime soon.
Well, now, Saul, let's go to the second clip, the one with Vladimir Putin being translated, okay? Let's go to that one.
Okay.
Peter, we're going to listen to Vladimir Putin talking recently and get your reaction to this. Let's play that. Saul, hit it.
This was the act of internal and external forces. There were people who protested against fuel price increases, but different people attacked government institutions, and they had a different agenda. And they used Maidan-like methods of benefiting from protests, and they used orchestrated groups of fighters who were clearly trained abroad. And as Mr. Tokayev has said, their attack against Kazakhstan was an act of aggression. I fully agree with this assessment.
Now, Peter, that's obviously Vladimir Putin talking about Kazakhstan. Do you agree with Putin's assessment of the situation in Kazakhstan there? What do you think, Peter Oliver?
I mean, we've been limited to exactly what we see from what I've seen anyway, coming out of what was happening in Almaty. But the way in which, particularly what I was talking about the way in which arms, there was videos of weapons being made very freely available to groups of angry young men. And when you do that, that takes a level of organization that you don't get from people protesting about subsidies from gas prices going. You know, there's protest, and then there's organization. There were levels of organization and sophistication shown on the ground in Almaty from the few videos that I've seen, and from the testimony of people who were there that I've heard, that would suggest that things had moved on, certainly well beyond people being upset that gas prices had gone up. So I would also suggest that Vladimir Putin may have access to better intel on the ground in Kazakhstan than I do. And it does seem that there has been something has been attempted to take place in Kazakhstan. The arrest of the
Peter,
former head of the security services.
Unfortunately, Peter Oliver, we're out of time. Fantastic appearance, as always. Great Peter Oliver. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about this, taking your calls, 202-521-1320. And Terry Smith's running us next hour here on The Backstory.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
And we are back for the second hour of The Backstory, the show that brings you the truth behind the headlines. I'm investigative journalist Lee Stranahan. This is The Backstory. It's always like a master's degree seminar whenever we have Peter Oliver on. That's a correspondent who really knows his material. And this is a complex situation that's not made any easier by the propaganda, particularly coming from the U.S. side. It's been weeks of BS but we appreciate Peter Oliver coming on to help us sort it out. Coming up this hour, Harry Smith from Unsafe Space. You're listening to The Backstory. And Rod, you got to admit, Peter does know his stuff. Plus, he sounds great, right?
Yeah, no, Peter's very informed about the things that, like you said, we're getting propaganda over here. I saw the statement from the, I just forgot her name right now, that Peter was talking about, and she's saying that it's a non-starter that NATO, on Russia saying that NATO should stop expanding. She said that's a non-starter, which is kind of crazy to me.
Right, and if anyone understood what it was about, they'd go, what? Why is it a non-starter? You know, Sergei Lavrov made a statement earlier. He said it came out through the official Russian Twitter site, where he said that NATO's purpose now seems geopolitical, trying to pick up what he called orphaned states in the Warsaw Treaty and the former Soviet Union. And he's right. NATO has a geopolitical purpose, which was not NATO's purpose, right? NATO's purpose was to protect Europe from the USSR at one point. Now, it's geopolitics, and that is frightening. Now, by the way, speaking of, well, I don't know how to put it, but you saw, Rod, that AOC has COVID-19, right?
Yeah, you know, COVID can't stay away from her. You know, it's in love with her, just like the Republicans who can't stop talking about her. So.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, of course, a week or two ago, she was getting a lot of flack for being maskless down in Miami at a bar down there, and now she's got COVID. So is AOC, is she going to be attacked by the media, do you think, as a super spreader? Rod?
Absolutely not. They don't hold any of these people accountable. We also saw another congressman in Florida with the queen of an African country maskless, and so no, they never get held accountable.
Yeah, it's just interesting, the hypocrisy on this. You know, one thing, and I'll talk to Kerry about this a little bit, and one theme I'll be expanding a little as we go through the week here on The Backstory is you've heard me say this before, Rod, but I'm just going to warn everybody. This is something that's going to come up. The Republicans and Democrats are both awful, right? We can agree on that. But I still say Democrats are worse. And that really bothers some people when I say that. But I'll stick. Do you agree with me that although both Democrats and Republicans, broadly speaking, have all kinds of problems, do you agree with me that Democrats are actually worse?
No, I agree with you on that point. Mainly, I would say because the Democrats, the nonstop use of Black people for their political gains, as we see with the voting rights, they're saying, you know, the Republicans they're racist when they want to stop Black people from voting, which is not true at all. As far as what they're just trying to limit, as you know, 24-hour voting or drop boxes and things like that are susceptible to fraud. But you know, Maxine Waters on TV today saying that, you know, the Republicans are racist. They want to keep Black people from voting.
Yes, and I got to say, I was talking to Jason Goodman, who will start having Jason on once a week as a co-host on Tuesdays, and along with Carmine Mondays. I do like the alliteration, even though it's in the middle of the word. We got Carmine, we get the am Mondays, but starting next week. I was talking to Jason about this, and there's a variety of reasons, and the way the Democrats use Black folks, and I don't know how else to put it, use is the right word, because and people hate if we love science so much now, right, then I think math relates to science, right? So by the math, if you want to save black lives, that Black Lives Matter. Cut the black abortion rate, which is multiple times the white abortion rate. I'm not even saying make it illegal. I'm saying do things. I know when my opinion started to change on the abortion stuff, I saw this a few years ago. This is when Obama was president. And let me think about this. This would have been around 2011, I think. So over a decade ago. What I noticed was there was this place, I think it was in Chicago, and they had a billboard out. And the billboard said, it was in a black neighborhood. And it said, watch out, you could be killing the next Obama. And it was a billboard designed to make pregnant black women ponder what they were doing. Does that make sense? And it was actually, if you think about it, that's praiseworthy of Obama in a sense, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, at the time I could see how they were praising him and using that to quell the abortion rate amongst black people, black women who get abortions. So yeah, I agree with you on that point.
And saying, hey, think about it. And this liberal group got the billboard taken down. Now, the point is, this is where I started to see the real censorship that happens on the left, which we've talked about numerous times, and it's very obvious. The left is in love with censorship now. And I was shocked by it because my opinion, saying you might want to reconsider getting an abortion for whatever reason, right? Because you could be killing the next, Barack Obama, let's say. Whatever you think about abortion, as a free speech advocate, I'm in favor of people being able to say that. You see what I'm saying? I could be completely pro-choice, but still defend their right to want to share that message with people. Okay? But they took that billboard down. They pressured to get that billboard taken down. That has nothing to do with the law. That has to do with censorship to me. And that's when I saw how, I don't know how to put it, sick they are. And we only saw it recently. You've seen on this show and other shows I've been the co-host of, bringing up Margaret Sanger doesn't go over well with some people, right? You've noticed that, Rod?
Yeah, for some people, it's a little touchy subject. And the fact that you bring her up, I didn't know that she had a street named after her in New York, so it's a little ironic.
No, right. There's a street named after her in New York. And when I bring her up, I'll put it like this. If I brought up Margaret Sanger and was like, well, I'm in favor of Margaret Sanger. She's done a terrific job. She wanted to abort more black babies. That's why she spoke to the KKK in New Jersey. She was a known racist and eugenicist. Is there any doubt that Margaret Sanger was a racist and eugenicist? Any doubt whatsoever? There's none, right?
No, she said it. She said it in her own words. I mean, you don't have to infer. She said it out loud.
And my point is, but if you bring up Margaret Sanger with some people, it doesn't go over well. And I'm going to say this: reducing the black abortion rate and murder rate, right? The problem with black on black violence, you could say, some people don't like it. Some people get very upset. People on the left, if you bring up black on black violence, get very upset about it. Now, what I'm not in favor of, and I see too many Republicans do, is they bring up black on black violence just as a talking point, and they don't really actually propose a solution for it. You see what I'm saying? I'm opposed to that, not just a talking point. If you really care about people, then it's okay to bring it up, but you should also have a solution for it. And I think one solution is you've got to enforce laws, and you've got to not be in denial about it and not be so touchy about the subject. But by reducing the black-on-black murder rate, which is, you know this from being Rod from Philly and watching what's going on in Philly, right? The numbers are outrageous, and the victims are mostly black. Same thing in Chicago, same thing in New York, right? And yet the Democrats think they're, by not talking about these subjects, by banning discussion about them, by getting bent out of shape and getting, in a knot certain parts of their apparel. I'm not sure if I can say that word even, but can I say panties, Rod? I'm not sure. Saul, let me ask you, not Rod. I think I can say panties and not, correct? Okay. Underwear. Saul's get bloomers. Can I say bloomers, or would be banned in England? I'm not sure. But the point is, right, not even sexy underwear, just normal day-to-day, possibly Mormon-inspired underwear. You've seen that, right, Rod? The Mormon special magic underwear, right?
Is it like the Amish?
It's, I guess. I don't know. I've never dated a woman who's either Mormon or Amish, or more Amish. I guess that would be if you combine the two. But they really don't like these subjects. And at the end of the day, I think what they're doing by being so flinty about the subjects is the result is more deaths of black people. Am I wrong on the math here, Rod? What am I missing?
No, you're right. I mean, it's obvious. It's plain as day. I mean, we just saw the recent district attorney in Manhattan who's not going to charge certain crimes like grand theft auto, shooting, any crime involving a gun. He's going to lessen the sentence, or he's not going to charge certain crimes. And obviously, he's funded by Soros, just like in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, who he's sitting on top of. Every year, he sets a new record for murder rate for number of murders in Philadelphia, number of shootings. The carjackings have exploded, set like 700%. It wasn't even a thing in Philadelphia. Now it's almost like a video game out there. It's like Grand Theft Auto. So it's plain as day.
And again, I'm going to argue that the number one victim of this is not going to be. I was talking to Jason about this today, and here's the thing. If you're white and live in the suburbs in a high-security building with a, doorman, you're going to be affected by this less than if you live in a high-crime area, period. The people who are going to be affected by this, hurt by this, are people who live in high-crime areas. So I don't see how they even think it's helping anybody. 202-521-1320. Let's go to our friend Brave in Atlanta. Well, I heard on Fault Lines this morning. He called in right at the end of the show. Hey, Brave, how you doing?
Hey, what's going on, Lee? I want to say again, I hate that Shane. I know this is not Fault Lines, obviously, but I hate that Shane is not on Fault Lines. So I hope that he's able to come back. But having said that, I just kind of want to chime in on your conversation concerning Democrats, Republicans, who's worse, and I guess get into the whole crime and black-on-black crime thing.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
I find it, first I have to say I find it so ironic, so I have to point out that I find myself rooting more so for Republicans now because of all of because of the craziness going on with the Democrats in light of the the mandates and all of this stuff with censorship. Not that I am a newly found Republican enthusiast or anything like that. It's just that I see the problematic nature of what the Democrats are doing, and so I haven't supported Democrats in a long time. Regardless, I typically vote independent, but I do find myself hoping more for Republican victories, if only to hold some of these Democratic efforts at bay. But that is more so as it relates to what they're doing with COVID and this insanity, this fascist insanity that they're going over the cliff with, as far as censorship and control. However, when the conversation you were having as far as like Black Lives Matter and saving black babies and crime and things of that nature, I think that one of the reasons why Republicans have always been on the losing side of that argument, and I think you kind of alluded to it just a little bit in your conversation, is that when they bring up black on black crime, and of course they always go straight to Chicago, right? But when they bring on black on black crime, when they bring the topic of black on black crime as a matter of showing what's really affecting black people, the problem is that they haven't done anything that shows that they truly care about it. So they're actually just using it as a talking point, which I think you said earlier. You can't really talk about black on black crime without talking about class, without talking about the impoverished nature of a lot of the inner city areas, without talking about the wealth gap, which is huge, because it's not so much, to me, in my opinion, black on black crime. It's just crime, and because that urban area may be full of black people.
Brave, ironically with the name Brave, let me stop you for a sec and give you the one counterpoint on that. Do you know who's poorer than black folks? Native Americans. Out here in South Dakota, we have some of the poorest counties in the entire United States. In Indian country, Native American country, out West River here. Two of the poorest cities and counties in America, where the average income was $3,000 a year, are out here. And I'll tell you, a few years ago when I looked it up, the numbers may have changed, but I'll bet they haven't changed by much. So first off, when I hear people bring up poverty causing crime, well, then by that standard, why isn't the most crime-ridden, why don't we hear about 20 people a weekend shot in South Dakota? You see what I'm saying? If poverty causes crime, then you'd think where you've got the most poverty, you'd have the most crime. But that's not the way it works. And when it comes to police shootings, the statistic I said, I haven't checked this number lately, but a few years ago when I looked it up, the ethnic group most likely to be killed by cops was not black folks, it was not Hispanic folks, it was not Asian folks, it was Native Americans. And the ethnic group least likely to kill a cop was Native Americans. And so I'm just saying, if you ask the logical question and start to do the research, if poverty causes crime, if that's the direct correlation, then where you have higher poverty, you'd expect higher crime and higher violent crime. That's not the way it works. Brave, what say you?
I would say that I've had that conversation before. I've had a debate before. First thing you would want to point out, you would want to consider when you're talking about Native American areas. First of all, a large portion of what our view of crime is, and what in the crime areas, and how much horrible it is in our case is media driven and media coverage driven. Right now, as it relates to Native American reservations and areas, true enough, those are some of the poorest areas, right? But as far as when you look at statistics on women being on rapes, on women being abducted, people disappearing, and things of that nature, they have crazy high numbers. but it doesn't seem to be talked about much at all, unless you have like a Native American activist who's at the time speaking about it and bringing attention to it. And this has been said, and as a matter of fact, there was a guest on an RT program speaking specifically about this, right? As far as crime goes on these areas or on these locations, this is hardly ever covered. Right, and so what those statistics are, as versus to what it would be in an urban city area, I still don't think it will be comparable, because you're talking about an urban city, a city of people living on top of each other, right? And I would imagine that the plights are different. However, that doesn't negate the fact that there would be crime there. There would be all kinds of drug abuse and things of that nature there. It's just not as covered. In the same way that the media spends a lot of time talking about black men being shot by cops, as if cops aren't shooting a lot of other people as well, right? Brown people, white people, of course, right? But the media narrative is such that it keeps the focus on black shootings, because we have this game we play where we pretend like racism and the ramifications of racism in our system as it is just between black and white. So when you talk about racism, it's just black and white, right? Like no one else is being affected by it, or no one else even is a race, right? So those things are more anecdotal because we're talking about media coverage. But when you're talking about the actual statistics, when you're talking about the actual things that matter, the idea that you would not consider the wealth gap, the idea that you would not consider that poverty is a leading cause of crime anywhere, I don't care what the race is I don't know, that's problematic. I mean, it's a great debate for left and right, because that's really all it comes down to is a little conversation, a little tug of war between Democrats and Republicans and supporters of either. So you can say, oh, Republicans are evil because they don't care about black people, and so go vote for the Democrats, and then the Democratic policies do nothing to change the economic well-being of the people in that community, and then like we'll continue to vote for them. Those are just games that we're playing. The reality is, if you don't change the poverty structure, if you don't change the economic disparity, you're going to have crime. I don't care if you have nothing but purple people and green people. If you have a group of people living on top of each other in an urban environment, right, where people got to eat, right, you're going to have crime. So I don't care what the race is in that area. It just so happens, because of America and how things have been structured up to this point, those larger numbers are black and brown people in those cities. But that doesn't mean there's not white people there. Like I called and talked to you on you guys on the show before about a time when I was in Ohio, and there were some areas in Ohio, like God, they were all white, and oh my God, them places were scary. And I'm from the hood. I didn't want to go through them. So it just really just depends. No. But that's why I say it's important to discuss the economic disparity, because it matters. And when you talk about black people are at the bottom of the map, which is why I don't understand why they keep voting Democrat. They're at the bottom of the map, and we're falling off at this point.
Well, I'm not sure which map. Great call, Brave. And I want to go to Sharif in 1 second. But what are you saying? They're at the bottom of what?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Hello?
You said they're at the bottom. In terms of what?
Statistically, when you look at combined wealth, when you're talking about the ethnic wealth gap, right? When you look at black wealth, it's at the very bottom. They play this game in the media where they talk about the combined buying ability of the black dollar and bull crap like that, and because you got because you have basketball players and football players and you have a president, that crap doesn't matter. The combined wealth of black people is at the very bottom. This is statistically known. It's statistically easy to prove. You can go on Google, even with all that propaganda. You can go on Google and find it very quickly. If you want some trustable information, you can go on DuckDuckGo and look it up very quickly. Black people are at the very bottom.
I want to look it up. You're saying it's below Native Americans. And last I looked, it was not.
Here's what I say to you. Whether they are below, whether the black community is below Native Americans or Native Americans are below black people, it's a race to the bottom either way, and it's not. And neither one of those communities are doing well. So it doesn't even really matter if we're neck and neck, or if one is popping the wheelie on the other. It doesn't matter. They're at the bottom, and it shouldn't be like that. There's no reason for it to be like that, and it's not just. And it's not a matter of.
Brave, great call, and we'll be talking more about this subject in the future here on the backstory. But great call. 202-521-1320. Make sure we get to our friend Tarif. Tarif, what is on your mind?
Thanks for taking my call. First, I'd like to say free drilling and science and the NIH need to be investigated. Evergrande is trying to push back the payments till July, so they won't default. So that's big news. They're having meetings today. And my other comment is dealing with Alex McCurry was talking about Ukraine. If it get colder in Europe, Ukraine might start siphoning off gas from the pipeline going to Poland and Germany. You know, and that's going to limit the gas flow to Poland and Germany and the rest of Europe, and that won't be good. And also, if U.S. put sanctions on put sanctions on Germany, that's going to affect Europe, and it's going to affect the price of gas all over the world because in the U.S., the price of gas is going to go up too because if we put sanctions on gas prime in Russia, and that ain't going to be good for the Democrats if that happens. So, yeah, that's my comments for today.
Well, yeah. You've been great about bringing up Evergrande in the past, and thanks for bringing it up again. It's a complex situation, and that's why we have people like Mark Frost on talking about it, who's accurately predicted what's going on, and we'll talk more about that in the future. Great calls, both of you. Thanks so much for calling in. Now, coming up next, Kerry Smith will be joining us, and I'm going to say again, quick programming note, starting next week, we're going to have Carmine Mondays, where Carmine Sabia joins us as a co-host on Monday, talking to guests. And then on Tuesdays, we'll have Jason Goodman on. And I'm trying to work out other people because I like the idea of not just... Here's the thing, Rod. Here's the thing about me, okay? I say this to every woman I date, that I'm a ponderous mofo. And eventually... they all believe me. Does it make sense? But that's what happens.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I warn them. I say, I'm ponderous. Because I am. I'm talking, you know, when you get me going on a subject, I'm talkative. I better be because I host a radio show. But I'm looking forward to, we'll see. It's a bit of a shakeup. But I've done the show solo before. And by solo, I mean, Rod, you were always there, so thanks to Rod. So it's not solo. You're not my imaginary friend, the rabbit, or anything, Rod. You're real, right?
I'm real.
Good, okay.
I'm real.
Just checking. I'm not imagining. Rod is not just a voice in my head. And Saul, I really would like to, let's see if we can figure out how to get Saul mic'd up. Can we figure that out, Saul? Is that possible? Okay. Good. I'm sure you and Andre can solve this technical problem. Speaking of technical problems, do you know what I got worked out today, Rod? I've been talking about this for a few weeks. I now have a 24/7 music and graphics channel. There's still a few technical problems, but I've got it up on a virtual computer. It's running, it's working. It's kind of neat. So people can follow me on Twitter, @Stranahan on Twitter. And, you know, one of the things I want to do on this show, Rod, as we go forward, is I'm going to post more stuff online because I want to go over, you know, we say that on this show, we bring you the truth behind the headlines. I was thinking about Russiagate. So few people actually understand Russiagate that I want to kind of reboot those stories on the show. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a big thing that people, you know, 4 years later still don't have a grasp on.
Well, and let me say this. We've talked about a guy, Brett Kimberlin. Nobody's talked about nobody else. There's no other Shane sometimes on Fall Lines. But really, nobody else in the media has picked up on Brett Kimberlin working with Alexandra Chalupa. Right? Have you seen it anywhere?
No.
And I was thinking about it. This is one of the areas where Republicans do suck. Nobody, not a single politician, has ever said, hey, what's going on with Brett Kimberlin? I'm going to say it again. The Democrats were working with a convicted serial bomber and adjudicated pedophile, Brett Kimberlin. The Democrats were working with him because he goes back to the Clinton campaign when Clinton was first running for president. We'll talk more about that. We'll reboot some of these stories and give you references. If you want to read more about it, we'll be able to do that. But coming up on the backstory, great friend of the show, the great Kerry Smith will be joining us right after this on the backstory.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Hi, I'm political analyst Garland Nixon.
And I'm political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist Dr. Wilmer Leon.
We're the co-hosts for The Critical Hour, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C.
We close out your day with a thorough and hard-hitting analysis of the day's top stories, where we bring in brilliant scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time, when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show,
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
And we are back on the backstory. I'm Lee Stranahan. This is a new backstory. I'm used to saying, Rod, with my partner. I got no partner. I'm solo in my life as well as on the show. But here we go. Joining us now, great friend of the show from Unsafe Space, the podcast, Kerry Smith. Hey, Kerry, how you doing?
Hi, Lee. Thanks for having me. I got my microphone fixed.
Thanks for... Good. And how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, too. Now, by the way, we may be talking to you soon about Unsafe Wednesdays, which is my idea, which is where we're going to have co-hosts on the show now. And we're going to have cool. Carmine Mondays. So my idea for Unsafe Wednesdays would be you or Carter, the great Carter Laren, who we love having on the show too, your podcast partner on Unsafe Space, maybe could come on Wednesdays. And this way you can draw straws or whatever. The loser has to go on and co-host with me. You see what I'm saying?
That sounds fun. That sounds like we started doing that on Fridays. We could just talk with a variety of people on Fridays, have different guests on. It's great.
Yeah, no, that's the idea. And we love having both you and Carter on. Now tell people, let's do the plug right away. Where can people find the Unsafe Space podcast at this point, Kerry?
You can find us at unsafespace.com, and there's links to everywhere we're at there.
Okay, now one thing we were talking about before you came on was my contention, and I'll be talking about this throughout the week, is that while Republicans and Democrats are both bad, Democrats are worse. Now, you talked about being in the cult of wokeness before. And we've talked about that at various times. But in your opinion, this is one thing I've noticed about Democrats in general and woke people. And I'm going to say it, I'll be as blunt as I can. I'm not going to offend your pure ears, Carrie. Don't worry. I'm not going to cuss. Don't worry. But Democrats are nasty. I'll say it again. The woke people, what I've noticed personally, they seem nastier to me, like more bitter, more angry, more quicker to be rude. That's what I mean by nasty. I mean more easily offended and flinty. Do you agree with me on that, Carrie?
I do agree with you on that. I don't think that's always been the case. I don't know for sure, but my gut is that that's not always been the case. It's just, I think that the left has been pulled further over into authoritarianism. And as it's being pulled in that direction, it's also pulling the center. It's moving the Overton window, and it's pulling the right as well. And so, I think I told you before, I was a lifetime Democrat. I voted for my first Republican in 2018. I voted for Ted Cruz because I thought he seemed the most liberal of my two options. The conservative has been pulled more into the center and is more liberal than someone like Beto, who is pushing for, government authoritarian policies over individual rights. So I think that's sort of what's happening on the policy level. And then in terms of being nasty, I also think it's just the left has been. We'll think about how could a party be overcome by a belief that the government has the right to own individuals and to limit individual rights. I think there's a kind of mass psychosis happening on the left. I know that term has become really popular in the past week. And I think that's because people have been circling around this and trying to put a name to this for a while now. But there is a kind of collective insanity that's been happening where people are nastier, people are behaving in ways that it fits a lot of characteristics of personality disorders and in the ways that people are behaving. And they're writing articles in the LA Times, like the one I just saw that said, the headline was something like, it's ghoulish to mock the deaths of the unvaccinated, but it's also necessary. And they're actually penning articles about why we should mock and make fun of and behave in ghoulish ways towards our fellow humans. Why we should be, it's like basically like in defense of dehumanizing people.
No, right. And so it's become this, I don't know what to call it, bullying. And when when I say nasty and rude, I don't just mean the pundits you see on Sunday mornings or whatever on the TV set. I mean people I know, people I considered friends of mine, some people I considered wives of mine at some points have become nastier. And I've noticed it. Am I right? I'm not asking you about anyone I know, but in your personal life, people you knew that you were friends with, have you seen that, or is it just when you look at politics writ large, Carrie?
Oh, yes. And that's part of what drove me out of the woke left, because I started seeing it increase in 2016. That's when I woke up, because all of a sudden I was seeing a lot of opinion pieces and things in my echo chamber of the woke left. They were arguing on behalf of not having empathy for Trump voters, why we should not have empathy for Trump voters, and things saying that, that we should be thinking of these people as Nazis. Every Trump voter, what is that, 63 million people in that election, that they're all Nazis, and at the same time saying we should be using physical force against Nazis, and then we're calling all Trump voters that. So I saw that happening on the left. I saw this lack of empathy, and there were people in my social circle at that time who, I don't know if you remember, in Dallas, there was the Black Lives Matter rally and a shooting that happened with a sniper who killed 6 police officers.
Yes. Very well.
In my circles, I was in a SJW echo chamber at the time that I had created, and people in my circles were kind of celebrating that. And that woke me up as well. So there was this dehumanization that was happening, and it kind of was jarring to me, because this isn't, I thought we were all liberals. And I started to look around and say, wait a minute, like, what is this that I'm in? This isn't what I thought it was. I don't believe in violence. I don't believe in the initiation of force. And so that started to open my eyes. And I think it's only gotten worse since I left in the past 4 or 5 years. Now you see people openly, and yes, in my social circle, I've lost friends over the COVID issue because they took that dehumanization that they were applying to all Trump voters, and now they're applying it to anyone who is not complying with COVID mandates. So if you're unvaccinated, or if you're vaccinated but you oppose mandates, I had a friend who put us all into one category of, we're less than, we're to be treated differently, and dehumanizing us is being encouraged, and that's happening from the left. So,
well, yeah,
I don't know.
And there is something, and I'll tell you, as much as the Republicans get called, for instance, on immigration, racist and everything else, I never saw an article one time ever that was, I know it sounds mean to say you shouldn't have empathy for refugees, but here's why you shouldn't. No one ever wrote that article. Did you ever see that? Did you catch that one? I never saw that. And because I think it would have offended people. And I'll tell you where I used to, when I noticed it years ago, because again, I was a Democrat in my I was a teenage libertarian, then the middle part, 20s, about a decade ago, I was a Democrat as well. And where I started to notice it was when we were homeschooling, because I've been a homeschooling parent for decades. Shane, my son, who used to go ball lines, Shane was homeschooled. And he wasn't homeschooled because we were religious, because we weren't. We homeschooled him because we thought the way to raise a more creative, independent child was not to put him through public school. Does that make sense? And yes. I noticed some Democrats, friends of mine, were like, I'd mentioned we were homeschooling, rather than be like, oh, cool. Especially if they said why, they said, well, we think it's a way to raise a more creative, independent kid. They were like, yeah, really? You're homeschool? And I was like, yeah. Why are you making that gas face? You know what I'm saying? They would get nasty about it. And then when we were living in California, my second wife and I noticed she's part of the reason she liked living in California was you could get things like raw milk. Do you know about raw milk?
I do, yeah. I got raw milk for a while here in Texas. My housemate was working at a farm.
Well, yeah, so some people like raw milk. They think there's benefits to it. They banned it in Santa Monica. You could no longer get in Southern California raw milk. And my wife was like, wait, I moved to California so you could get things like raw milk, because you couldn't get them in Peoria where she grew up. And I noticed that on things they shouldn't be authoritarian on, they became authoritarian, even at a sort of, you know what I'm getting at, Carrie? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, I have noticed that. They have what's the book? There's a book by Jonathan Haidt called is it The Religious Mind? It's been a while since I've read it. It's the subtitle is The Righteous Mind, and it's why good people are divided by politics and religion. And in that book, he talks about how people on the left we tend to think of people on the right have this sort of, if you look at different kinds of morality as like channels, like we have different channels or flavors of morality. And he argues that conservatives have more than liberals. Well, one that conservatives have in common with liberals is the care harm principle. Like both conservatives and liberals think it's wrong to harm someone, that's immoral, right? But he says that conservatives have a few more of these flavors or channels of morality, and one of those is purity. And so we hear about that a lot, actually, with conservatives find things to be immoral or impure in terms of sexuality, for example. But he was saying, well, leftists have that channel too. It's just that their taste bud for something that's impure, being immoral, tends to be more centered around food. Isn't that interesting? And so that's where their authoritarianism will come out. Yeah.
And I had a friend of mine, a good friend, a woman who she was brilliant. And she was a Democrat, and she went to the Democratic National Convention, that kind of Democrat, and really brilliant. And she was at a small gathering of liberal women in Texas where she lives. And it was just Democrats. And the issue of abortion came up. And it was just women there, and they were all Democrats, and they were all pro-choice. And she said, yeah, but we can admit, it's just us Democrat women here, that abortions are awful. She said, I've had one, and it's like being vacuumed out. She said, it's horrible, right? And the other women, and she did not say this publicly. Does that make sense? She was at like a bookstore meeting. And they were all like, you can't say that. And she's like, yes. What do you mean I can't say that? I had an abortion. It wasn't fun. It was unpleasant. It was awful. And I'm pro-choice, but can I say, and they said, no, you can't say that. Does that experience strike you as the kind of thing that, it seems like to me like it's of a piece, like the things liberals can't talk about?
Yeah, and it relates to what you're saying about the way people treated you when they found out you homeschooled. Because when I was in that cult, and I do call that part of the left a cult, although it's a very large cult now, but you're not allowed to have certain opinions, and neither of those surprised me at all. When I was in that cult, I was taught to think of all homeschoolers as these Cro-Magnon, stupid, low IQ, religious fundamentalist parents who were doing their children a great harm. That was a stereotype that was pushed. And something else that was pushed in that cult and still is pushed even more today is that abortion is something to be celebrated. I mean, they used to say, we want to make them safe, legal, and rare. But that's not the way it's talked about now. That's not the way it was talked about when, 20 years ago when I was moving into the social justice world. It's now talked about as like there's nothing morally wrong with it. It's not awful. And in fact, you should celebrate it. It should be like a party. You should be proud. It's empowering. Shout your abortion. These are the kinds of things that they push now. It's not we want to make it rare. No, there's nothing rare about it. So I don't know. I'm still, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you on your journey when it comes to issues. So I'll if we're playing show and tell, I'll go first. Again, I moved from being a Democrat to considering myself a Republican. And the last issue for me, the one that was toughest for me was abortion, actually. That was for me the last one to go. A lot of the other issues I could go, but I really had to think about it. And for me, what it was is I realized that even though I was still saying I was pro-choice, in my own personal life, I hadn't been acting that way. Like the idea, if you looked around it, because by that time I'd had 6 kids, and if someone said, well, which one would you have aborted? The question's offensive. And there was never a point in those kids where I was considering, with my wife at the time, where we considered having an abortion. And so for me, I was, in fact, factually pro-life in my personal life. I was like, well, yeah, I wouldn't do that. And it's not even a moral judgment. It's just like, I just wouldn't do it. So, Carrie, when you made the switch, what was the last issue for you? What was the sticking point issue for you, if there was one, Carrie Smith?
Well, that's an interesting question, and thank you for sharing your past with me, because I don't think I'm done. I don't know. I'm still moving. There are a lot of things I don't know what I think about yet, and so I'm trying to take my time. When it comes to abortion, that's something I've been moving on for a few years. I went from thinking when I was in that cult that there was nothing wrong with it in terms of morality, that it wasn't immoral, and that it wasn't even a negative thing. And now I view it as something that is deeply immoral. You're killing a human being. There's no question about what's happening. The question, as I see it, is whether that should be legal or illegal. So whether that should be legally called murder or not. And I still am pro-choice in that, because I do have a sticking point with the government telling a woman what she can do with her body. However, I also believe that if you remove that problem of two beings, of one being, being inside the body of another being, like if the baby can survive on its own outside of the womb, I don't think you should allow abortion. I think the baby should be born. And medical science keeps pushing that date further back. So I'm still thinking about this. I've had pro-life friends who have asked me, well, so does your definition of when the baby has a right to live is completely defined by advances in medical science? Well, then why is that a good thing to base your definition of when life begins? Or, I don't know if I'm making sense, because I'm still thinking through it.
No, you are.
So,
you're making perfect sense. Yeah. No, I'll tell you where I come down on that in the hopes that maybe it will help in some sense. Mm-hmm. Part of what I do is when I look at a lot of people's pro-life position, I think they're more interested in changing laws, overturning Roe v. Wade or whatever, than they are about helping mothers. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I see people on the right who obviously they spend a lot of time focused on the law changing. And instead of doing that, the most frightening statistic to me, I've talked about this a little bit on the show before, but Planned Parenthood themselves have done surveys of why women get abortions. And about 25 to 30% of women get abortions because the guy in the relationship wants them to?
No, I didn't know that.
So think about that for a second. Ponder that for a second. So this supposedly it's a women's rights issue, right? And it's supposedly it's a feminist issue, right? We're pro-choice because we're pro-women and pro-feminist. But I'm going to say that if you get pressured into getting an abortion because the guy doesn't want to have a baby, there's nothing remotely independent, pro-women, or feminist about that, right? I mean, am I missing something? But that's pretty shocking to me. And I think when I started to think about that, I was kind of like, well, why should a guy who's not going to have the abortion be in any position to, and again, this is Planned Parenthood's numbers. So this is a clearly pro-abortion group saying that 25% of abortions are men. So therefore, if I said we could cut out 25% of abortions by urging men to don't ever pressure your girlfriend. Does that make sense? Like if you get a girl pregnant, don't make, see, because I really do, the term morality, I'm just iffy on that sometimes because it gets thrown around as a weapon. But if you think about it, practically speaking, nobody should object to a PR campaign saying to men, if you get a woman pregnant, help the woman you got pregnant. Does that make sense? Make sure you're going to help take care of the baby financially, and don't urge her, hey, have an abortion.
Yeah. Now,
that's harder because a lot of those men who urge them to get an abortion are Democratic politicians. Sure, that does happen. We see that occasionally a Republican one. But I really think that starts to, when you get practical about abortion, in other words, what would actually, forget the law, forget even talk of morality, what would actually end up with more babies being born? Stopping pressure campaigns against women by men. That's one of the ways I look at it, is just practically. Does that make sense or help in any way, Carrie? It may
does,
not.
And I think a lot of people actually, I think conservatives possibly should focus more on changing the culture so that people aren't choosing this. Not to say that if they believe it should be illegal, they shouldn't also pursue that. I think there need to be more culture changers, because I'll tell you, the message I was getting, the culture was telling me one thing, and I wasn't receiving, maybe that was the part of the world I was in, but I wasn't receiving a lot of messages from culture that challenged me to think about, when I was younger, to think about this issue in terms of what's right and what's wrong. I was just thinking about it in terms of women's rights. That's what culture is saying for me to think about. Women's rights, empowerment, and what's legal, and what should be legal and what shouldn't be legal. And nobody was saying, but is this do you think this is a good thing for a woman to choose as a personal choice? And I think there's something missing there. But this goes back to the bigger issue, which is, and what we try to do at Unsafe Space, which is just, changing the culture.
And one way to think of the culture is think, if you had a friend, right? I'm sure you do have friends. I'm not saying, that's not the theoretical part, Carrie. But if you had a friend who was pregnant, who said to you, Carrie, what should I do? What would you tell them? That's kind of a good, I think that's a good way to think about it. And you'd try to help them, right? You wouldn't, and if you'd listen to why if they were thinking of getting abortion, you'd go, well, why are you thinking of doing that? And if they said, I'm really worried I'm not going to be able to afford a baby or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You'd try to help them with that problem. You wouldn't immediately call up your local congressman and say, hey, can you talk to my friend Sylvia here? I think she might get an abortion. Can you talk her out of it? Can you stop her? Send the police over. Right? And so that's the way, the culture is, in a sense, just a bunch of people. Right?
Yeah. But I would go back even further than that. I mean, I think that we need to start talking about sex differently and responsibility differently, because we've sort of divorced sex from pregnancy. And people don't even, a lot of women, I don't think they even think of the whether or not they want to be mothers when they engage in sex, because there's this idea of like, well, I can always abort. I don't have to consider that now. Like, if I were to get pregnant, I could just abort. If they think of it as something as devoid of morality. It's something like getting your tonsils removed, where this isn't ending a life. And so there's something wrong with that, I think, too. The way that we treat sex now is so flippant. It's all about, like, as if it's only about getting off. That's not what it's only about. So,
but a good Prince reference, I will say. Well done. So it's a great song, by the way. And he says, let a woman be a woman, let a man be a man. I'm not sure Prince, that would be unpopular nowadays. But Carrie Smith, thanks so much for joining us. Fantastic appearance, as always. Carrie, expect a call maybe from Rod soon to talk about bringing you or Carter in on Unsafe Wednesdays co-hosting, because we'd love to have you as a regular part of the show, even more regular than you are now. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for the great calls, Brave and Tarif. We'll be back tomorrow on best damn radio show still in the world. It's The Backstory.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Good evening. Welcome to the Critical Hour. We're coming to you from the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C., here on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist, Dr. Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, political analyst, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
For the next 2 hours, we will explore and analyze the salient news stories that are impacting the global village in which we live. The U.S. delegation and Russia delegations met in a bid to defuse crisis on the Ukraine border. They met in Geneva today for high-stakes talks as part of a broad diplomatic effort to avert another invasion of Ukraine. For insight into this, we turn to our first guest. He's a Moscow-based international relations and security analyst, Mark Sleboda. As always, Mark, welcome back.
Dr. Leon, Garland, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the Critical Hour.
So what I just read was the standard Western media description of what's going on about these diplomatic efforts in order to prevent an invasion of Ukraine. But Russia tells U.S. it has no plans to invade Ukraine. It's reported here in the West that after a day of intense talks, Russian officials said they will continue discussions with the U.S. Wendy Sherman, the top American diplomat, said she pushed back on security demands that were non-starters. Mark, as I understand it, it's not so much about the Ukraine as it is about medium-range and hypersonic missiles being placed in Europe. Those are the real security concerns here. Since the U.S. backed out of the medium-range missile treaty during the Trump administration, it's really about whether or not an agreement can be reached about the placement of missiles in Europe by both sides, and that Russia is willing to negotiate, and it's the United States that's taking the harder line here. Is that assessment accurate, Mark Sleboda?
I would say no. I would say it's the exact opposite. What the Russia presented for Russia's position, this is about their own national security, which they increasingly feel at threat as they see the de facto military NATOization on the ground occurring in NATO, with some 10,000 NATO trainers and advisors, quote unquote. The UK announcing that they're going to be building military naval bases in Ukraine, and the increasing amount of advanced NATO, US NATO armaments that are being sent to the regime in Kiev. They highlighted their broad security concerns with details on several issues. First of all, from the Russian perspective, is that NATO should and must not expand further eastwards toward Russian borders. Specifically, that Ukraine and Georgia should not continue to be offered NATO membership at any time in the future. We have to remember that in 2008, at the NATO meeting in Bucharest, that the NATO declared in their official 2008 statement that Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO at some point in the future. And at the time, the percentage of the Ukrainian population that wanted to join NATO was 20%. So that, I mean, obviously they have worked ever since then to force the issue to geopolitically flip Ukraine and bring it into the Western orbit. There were a number of other issues, basically the forward placement of NATO troops since 1997, before the rounds of NATO expansion. And then there's also, get down into the details like, placement of missiles in the European theater, with the U.S. having unilaterally pulled out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and so on. But for Russia, this is about big things, and everything has to be taken together. The U.S. position going into this is they are willing to revisit a partial restoration of the INF, geographically restricted to the European theater, because they're far more interested in not having their hands tied by the INF as it existed with regards to China and the Western Pacific, where they do want to place land-based intermediate range weapons. Ballistic weapons. And they are willing to possibly talk about decreasing the speed and tempo, the scale and tempo of NATO military exercises right on the NATO border. I.e., they're cherry picking a few details out of here that they are possibly willing to compromise on and saying no on the big issue things like expansion of NATO eastward, and particularly in Ukraine. Russia's position going into these talks is the opposite. That these small details on these things, were brought up in our draft proposals, but it's the big picture things about eastward expansion of NATO and Ukraine that is the big focus for us. So that is where they both were going into the meeting.
So where was I wrong in what I said?
Well, I mean, it is not all about agreement on missile placement, agreements on the placement of intermediate range missiles in Eastern Europe, Ukraine in particular, from the Russian side. That is just a deal detailed for them. Basically, the U.S. is trying to get the negotiations lost in the details, toss Russia a few breadcrumbs that they could then use as a, quote, off-ramp and accept this as a victory. And Russia's position going into the talks is saying this is not a grab bag that you can pick and choose from, a few small details, a few small bones to toss us. We want a big picture security agreement and a revisit of, further NATO expansion eastward.
Okay.
Now, let me throw this at you, Mark. If I'm Russia, and I got a kind of feeling that they were saying this in the beginning, because let's face it, I think it's obvious. If I'm Russia going into this, here's what I think. Number one, I'm dealing with incompetent fools who don't have the ability, as they have clearly shown in all of their misadventures, they do not have the ability to understand their allies, much less adversaries or potential adversaries. Number one. Number two, even if they did, I couldn't trust him as far as I could throw a T-72 tank. So even if they were to say, all right, well, we'll not do quite as many things on the Black Sea border, within hours they'd be doing 5 times more things than they did on the Black Sea border that they just promised that they do anyway. So do you think Russia is every bit as cynical as Garland Nixon when you're talking to the likes of Tony Blinken and Wendy Sherman and these people who have the intellect of a bag of ice?
Well, I would say that at least when it comes to the Blinkens and Wendy Shermans, compared to some previous administrations, at least they are long-term policy professionals. I would agree that they do not consider the interests of their adversaries, their allies, much less their adversaries, simply because they believe they are in a power position where they do not need to, and they believe that through their ideology of exceptionalism that they are in a moral position that they should not take on board the interests, be they security, national, or otherwise, of other countries.
Mark,
yep,
they're sociopaths, Mark. They're sociopaths. Okay, let's not try to over-explain this thing. These people are malignant narcissists at best, psychopaths at worst. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, they do have a tendency to warmongering in pursuit of their geopolitical goals, and I certainly feel a threat from them living, in Moscow, my family in Crimea, and so on. So, there is definitely some of that and some trepidation there. I don't think they're willing to compromise on anything substantial that will alleviate Russia's big picture concerns, and I don't think that Russia is interested in this off ramp I don't think that they are even considering it at this point. But we'll see after the result of these talks. I don't expect any kind of signed statement, any kind of agreement written down on paper coming out of today's talks, or if ever. But certainly not immediately. But it is within the U.S. wants to drag these talks out. They are happy with the status quo in Ukraine. As far as they're concerned, they're creating military and political facts on the ground that they feel, once in place, can never be reversed. Whereas Russia feels a sense of urgency, and they do not want the talks to be dragged out, and they want the big picture things talked about up front. And if they are not willing to be negotiated on, then they said, we will have to take some type of military technical measures in response. And they're being deliberately vague on that. That it could, kind of an all options are on the table, type statement, the equivalent of that could be, more forward-placed Russian military units in Western Russia. It could be the placement of new weapon systems, perhaps hypersonic missiles in Kaliningrad, or Russia could say, well, you are presenting a security threat to us in Ukraine. We could always revisit opening a military base in Cuba. That sort of thing, or it could, be to the drastic step of some type of military intervention in Ukraine. I don't think any decision has yet been taken by the Kremlin, but I think that they've created the situation where they could take multiple options as they see are necessary coming out of these negotiations.
Sputnik International reports Moscow won't stoop to discussing NATO demands on de-escalation measures on Russia's own territory. Talk about that.
Yeah, so what the U.S. has started talking about in recent days, in response to, particularly complaints about U.S. placement of U.S. troops right on Russian borders and the insane scale and tempo of U.S. and NATO military drills right on Russia's borders, with demanding where Russia place its troops within its own country. And Russia's position on this to the U.S. is, if you had not expanded NATO eastwards, as was once promised to Russia, even if only verbally and informally, then you would not feel any type of concern about where we place our troops within our country. You've created that crisis for yourself, and we are not going to dictate where in our you cannot dictate to us where in our own country we place our troops. If you had allowed for some neutral space, some buffer space between us, it wouldn't be a problem. Now that you're no longer satisfied with the neutrality of Ukraine and other countries, that you want to expand NATO right up to those borders, then that's your problem. But you don't dictate to us any more than we could dictate to you where you put military forces in your own country.
Is this the first round of discussions? Is this more of a feeling out, fact-finding mission? What do you see coming out of this?
Yeah, certainly nothing is going to be signed, after the first meeting. It depends on how Russia takes the U.S., what they're willing to compromise on, whether they're willing to accept a few breadcrumbs and walk away and declare it a victory or not. I do not think they will. I do think we will see some follow-up meetings, but I think the rhetoric will probably increase in hostility even beyond what it is on both sides. And I would expect to start to see Russia to take some type of military technical actions, although probably not to the drastic scale that we are reading about in the headlines, at least not in the beginning, to try to push the urgency of the talks that Russia feels themselves.
Mark Sloboda, as always, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thanks for having me.
You're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon. There's more on the other side. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Kazakhstan's leader blasts riots as coup d'etat plot, masquerading as spontaneous protests. A wave of mass riots unfolded when religious radicals, criminal elements, outright bandits, looters, and petty hooligans emerged as if by a single command, the Kazakh president Kassym-Jomart Tokayev said. What are we to make of this? Well, for insight, we turn to our next guest. He's a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer and author of Scorpion King, America's Suicidal Embrace of Nuclear Weapons from FDR to Trump. He served in the Soviet Union as an inspector implementing the INF Treaty, served in General Schwarzkopf's staff during the Gulf War, and from 91 to 98 served as a chief weapons inspector with the UN in Iraq. Scott Ritter, as always, Scott, welcome back.
Well, thanks for having me.
So your thoughts, masquerading as spontaneous protests, a wave of mass riots unfolded when religious radicals, criminal elements, outright bandits, looters, and petty hooligans emerged as if by a single command. Your thoughts, Scott Ritter?
Well, I mean, that's a sort of a political interpretation by a politician to explain events that are, when you dig into the cause for these events are very disturbing from a domestic political situation. Let's be clear. The reports that were coming out as they were occurring spoke of legitimately concerned citizens in the streets protesting inconsistency and corruption in the Kazakh government. Now, the protesters themselves will say, our protest was hijacked by young men wearing masks who suddenly appeared and started to call the shots, direct and be violent against anybody who sought to get the protest back on track. And these aren't just a handful of young men. The numbers being put out there by the Kazakh government, is upwards of 20,000 of these young military-aged men. Fit, well-organized, and possessing a plan. Most demonstrations, especially spontaneous demonstrations that occur because of an overnight event, like, for instance, the doubling of the price of liquid petroleum gas, aren't well-organized. It's just people getting out in the street and sort of walking around and chanting and this, and they're generally not violent. They're protesting. They're not out there trying to raise an insurrection. This turned almost instantly into an insurrection. And not just, I'm not talking about Molotov cocktails and overturning cars and stuff. I'm talking about targeted seizure of weapons. In some cases, it appears that some Kazakh security forces were guiding these guys to weapons stores, were supportive of them. And I'll get to that in a second. And then pitched battles, not a cop firing, 41 shots in the back of a fleeing person or something like that. I'm talking about gun battles where you have hundreds of people on one side against hundreds of people on the other side in a sustained firefight exacted casualties, significant casualties on both sides. That's not a demonstration. That's not a riot. That is an insurrection. That is a battle, and that's what's happening. And it appears that they've made significant arrests of very senior people, including some in the security services, who it appears have been planning this for some time. And the key question is this a domestic-driven coup d'etat, or was there outside interference? Now, the Kazakh government is claiming outside interference, but hasn't presented any evidence of that yet. And one would think that most governments would like to blame it on the outside rather than taking the hard, critical look at what actually causes inside. In the first conversation we had, I spoke of the clannish nature of Kazakhstan, and I do believe when all this is said and done, you're going to find that this is very much a family affair, that there are especially former allies of the former president Nazarbayev, who remained in government were being squeezed out of the corrupt, sources of income, extra income. And they were unhappy about this, and they were making a move. It doesn't seem as if Nazarbayev was part of this. He willingly resigned from his position as the head of the National Security Council, and he's been actively cooperating with the Kazakh government today on what has transpired. But it appears that his allies weren't happy with the situation. Now, we also know that the U.S. and British intelligence services are extensively involved in Kazakhstan. I can say that based on personal knowledge and information, and there's just no debating it. When you have oil companies intertwined into the political, economic, and social affairs of a nation, intelligence services aren't going to let that opportunity to embed themselves go past. And I won't say any more because that'll probably give away the farm. But we're there. The Brits are there, and I haven't met a foreign internal situation of unrest yet that the CIA and the British didn't want to get involved in and turn to their affairs. So I think what we're looking at with Kazakhstan is a blend of two. That this is not something that the CIA or British MI6 could have ginned up by themselves. That this is indeed part and parcel of a domestic, political, and social and economic rupture that's derived from clan-based corruption, and that the U.S. and the British, once they saw that it was there, helped guide it, maybe helped focus it. But that was it. It's not as though there were airdrops of weapons or people were taken out of the country for training. There may have been some of this internet-based stuff that the State Department and the CIA is so good at, pulling the youth out to teach them so-called digital democracy. That's something the U.S. has been very fond of. We've seen that in Syria, Iran, and elsewhere. But the Kazakh government had the answer to that. They turned off the internet, and so that was that. There's no more coordination taking place because the internet no longer exists. But that's what I see going on right now. And the other lesson to come out of this is Russia's approach, which can be just said in a couple words: no more Maidans. There will never again be a Maidan. Russia will never again allow a domestic political situation in what it determines its sphere of influence, the near abroad, the former Soviet republics, to be dragged out to a manner in which it can be controlled by outside elements. The decisiveness of the Russian intervention, the decisiveness of the Kazakh government's intervention was such that there was no chance for a Maidan. There was no chance for the EU, the OSCE, the United States, or NATO to get ginned up about this. By the time you started to hear people, saying those magic words, human rights, it was over. So I think that's the other key lesson here, is that never again will Russia allow a Maidan situation to occur.
Should somebody ask Victoria Nuland where the protesters in Kazakhstan got their cookies from?
Yeah, that's probably a question that's going to arise at some point. Let me ask you this, too, as a result of this. If you are the government of any country, you're in Western Asia, you're in and around the Russian border, and you see what happened in Ukraine, and then you see the result. Ukraine is a toilet. I mean, it's just a mess right now. I'm reading every day you read, it's worse. But you see Belarus, which made it through an attempted coup. You see what happened here. I would imagine that the leadership of the countries on the Russian periphery are all saying now, if you're running the country, we better be close with the Kremlin. We better have a plan. We better be looking over our shoulders. We probably better be weeding through all of the leaders right now of our countries. I mean, if I'm any random leader or group of leaders of a country on that Russian border now, I'm looking over my shoulder and I'm saying, let's stay tight with the Kremlin because we could be next. So in a way, I mean, the Russians really benefit from this, because I would think that leaders in the area now kind of look towards Russia saying, hey, guys, we may need a hand. Just be on standby. What are your thoughts? Am I overstating things, Scott?
No, you're 100% correct. Russia, there's still a element of confusion in Russia, I would say, for the past several decades since President Putin took control. Confusion that while some aspects of Western governments were disingenuous and maybe didn't have Russia's best interests at heart, that from an overall perspective, the West wasn't that bad, that there were people who really wanted to be legitimate business partners. There was people who respected Russian culture enough to be invited in and to have meaningful dialogue, debate, discussion, etc. I think those days are done. I think, there's not too many people left in Russia who can take a look at any American institution. I don't mean just government institution. I mean any state institution, academics, think tanks, businesses, and not see nefarious intent. The West is not Russia's friend. That's just the bottom line, and that's a darn shame because there is a great potential for friendly relations, productive relations that are mutually beneficial. But the West is not Russia's friend, and I think that's the big wake-up call right now, is that Russia and its sphere of influence must view anything that has a link to the West as being nefarious in intent, and it must be opposed violently if necessary.
Well, I think it just, Scott, comes to a great degree with the America's inability to deal with the unipolar versus multipolar geopolitical landscape.
Yes, we need to be it's not just a unipolar landscape, it's a unipolar mindset. I mean, the concept of American exceptionalism, that we alone are empowered. And thank goodness the president said, but you hear from some Americans, empowered by God. I mean, we're not just empowered by who we are, we're empowered by God to
manifest destiny.
The anointed ones. Yeah, this is global manifest destiny, and it's just it's comic if it weren't so dangerous and serious. And Russia is not seeking that. I mean, I had to laugh when I heard Tony Blinken, repeat Victoria Nuland's statement. Russia is seeking to resurrect the Soviet Union. There's only one nation in the world that's holding on to a relic of the Cold War, and that's the United States holding on to NATO.
And so let me ask you this, to that point, because we only got about 2 minutes left. To that point, the influence of Brzezinski and that staunch Russiaphobe Brzezinski and the impact that he's had on the U.S. State Department and that mindset.
Well, the State Department, yes, there's no doubt that Brzezinski, had some influence, but even more than that, we had people like Daniel Pipes and his father, Richard Pipes, who were advising Reagan and such. But remember, for all of that, we had a guy like Jack Matlock, who was the ambassador to the Soviet Union during the critical times of bringing an end to the Cold War. And with Matlock was an entire generation of intellectual thinkers who were open-minded about the Soviet Union, about Russia. They've been pushed aside. They were pushed aside by Bill Clinton. They were jammed aside by George W. Bush. And, Obama ignored them, Trump ignored them, and Biden has ignored them. They no longer exist. We no longer have a cadre of sound-thinking Russian experts. All we have right now are what I call the Putin whisperers, these Russophobes, these people who hate Russia, hate Putin, and believe America has been endowed by God to be the only unilateral great power left in the world today, and all must bow to us. I mean, I just was watching Ned Price give his press conference about, the collapse of the discussions in Geneva and the spinning that was taking place there. It's appalling. We believe that we alone are right, that Russia has no right to put any claim on the table.
Scott Ritter, as always, thank you so much for that analysis. We look forward to having you back.
Thanks for having me.
You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon. There's more on the other side. Stay tuned.
We are are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Twitter suspends the account of Unity4J, prominent Julian Assange free speech support community. Twitter recently decided to delete one of the biggest accounts defending Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. The group at Unity4J was banned from the website. As reported by the owners of the account, Twitter removed the account without any prior warning or providing any opportunity to appeal the decision. What are we to make of this? Well, for insight, we turn to our next guest. He's the national organizer for Action for Assange, Steve Poikonen. Steve, as always, welcome back.
Thank you, Wilmer. It's good to be back.
So it appears that Twitter has made multiple attempts to suppress those who want to publicly defend Julian Assange. This particular Unity4J case is just the latest of the string of offensive actions taken by Twitter in regards to people who consider and position themselves as defenders of Assange and WikiLeaks. Steve Poikonen.
Well, yes, and this is just sort of a microcosm of what happens to Assange supporters around the world. The Unity4J account was essentially a support and retweet account. It wasn't even taking its own positions on any particular issue of the day. All it did was let people know when events were coming up or when court dates were coming up or if anything particularly breaking had happened throughout the course of the case, as so often we found out it has. For Twitter to remove an account as passive as this, that is simply there to just kind of help proliferate information that's already circulating, very troubling, because there are a lot of people that are going harder than that with a little bit higher profile or a little bit smaller profile that are getting picked off as well.
You know, to me, this is another, I mean, if people didn't already know and understand what Twitter is, it is and I use this word loosely, a tool or maybe even an appendage of the national security state. There was a time when they would try to at least justify the things they did, or there was some level of, trying to hide it. Now it appears that the national security state is unabashedly using Twitter to A, go after smite their enemies, and B, to just simply censor anyone who takes a position or supports anything that the national security state has put its crosshairs on. Steve.
Well, every time that you have social media executives hauled in before a congressional panel, the debate is not when or how immediately to stop censoring. It's what narratives you want censored more, what speech you want should be prioritized in terms of what gets censored or what gets removed. So the conversation begins at a fundamentally incorrect position and then just goes off the rails in that direction. The idea that there's somehow, you see it on Twitter all the time. Well, this is a private business. They're allowed to do whatever they want to do. And if they, feel like this account violated the rules, that's what, no, because you're